are assimilation, elision, compression, and liaison. And these terms have been about, most of them, for quite a long time. They are special linguistic terms with fairly narrow defined meanings. There are popular terms for the same sort of thing too. Assimilation could be called contamination, if you wanted another word for it, because it's the effect of one sound upon another. And it can work in two directions. You can have a sound being anticipated and made too early, if you want to put it that way, or a sound being affected by one that was previous to it when it turns up. But the best way to deal with this is to take examples of it. So here we are then, we're looking at the kinds of change that are undergone by words in connected speech. Paragraph 3 was the one that refers to tomorrow's topic of weak form words in particular. Those are the most important of all, as you'll see tomorrow, because failure to use those words can really cause a lot of problems. I think everybody's aim is to avoid sounding grossly unnatural in their speech, and everybody wants to be understood clearly and easily. To do that, you have to operate the same system as native English speakers do. And one of the interesting things about the English language is it's spoken very diversely in different parts of the world. In different parts of the world, even the same sound can suggest a different word to people. If I, for instance, say bed to you, and that's the only word you ever hear me say, you've no idea what word I'm using, because you don't know what my accent is, unless you've heard me speak several words. But a native English speaker identifies the accent of somebody he's speaking to within a few seconds, within a few syllables. And as soon as he's identified it, then he knows what adjustments to make. So if he hears bed, and then he hears that the speaker is Australian, he knows that the word he just heard was the opposite of good. But if, when the speaker goes on and says some more syllables, he identifies him as a speaker of British English, then he knows bed is a thing you lie on to go to sleep in at night. And then that's not a unique case. You can find other similar examples to that, where, in fact, we understand each other in spite of the fact that we operate in such different ways. Now, what is it then that makes us, and have no doubt about this, a well-educated, intelligent, sophisticated person, one who is not an absolute idiot, if you like, in any part of the English-speaking world, has no difficulty whatsoever in understanding a speaker from another part of the English-speaking world of a similar intelligence and education. Only modest education, I'm not saying highly educated, but normally educated. Right? So, now what is it then that we all have in common that helps us understand each other so easily and readily? Well, one of the most important things of all is, although we don't necessarily have the same, even the same number of vowels, for instance, and we don't all use our consonants exactly the same way. A lot of Americans use a D, where British speakers use a T, and all sorts of things like that we can point to, differences between different accents. But we understand each other with complete ease. The only problem we have is just occasionally some isolated word, for a moment we might not know what it was. But this happens once in hundreds of hours of talking to people. Very unusual for that to crop up, that you really have failed to understand. I suppose, to tell the truth, most even well-educated English persons in Britain, if they hear Darsal, for instance, will perhaps be phased by it, be unsure what the word was, unless, of course, it's in a very obvious context. Because Darsal is the way an American speaker pronounces the word docile in English, docile, tameable of an animal. Anyway, occasionally you get that sort of thing, but it's very hard for me to think of a second example of it even. So we understand each other very easily, very readily, and so what is it that unites us? What is it that we share and don't differ in? Well, it's the way we treat words. It's the way we operate, particularly this system of weak form words. Now, there aren't many of these, fortunately, only about 4 dozen. but they are the most often used words in the language. In fact, if we take together the two words, of which I shall give you a complete list tomorrow morning, a list of these words which are weak form words and contractions, if we take those and put them together, they only amount to about 100 words. And those 100 words have to be, if you talk normal English conversation, they have to be 1 in every 4 words that you use. 25% of the words you're using all the time, every day, in conversational English. So, obviously, their proportion of occurrence is enormous compared with any other word you learn. And there's no doubt about it, too, that we vary the way we handle them a great deal. And we make them undergo these processes I'm just going to deal with now with you: assimilation, elision, compression, and liaison. We make them undergo these things, but the important thing then is that with very few minor exceptions, they operate in the same way in all the varieties of English around the globe. So, we're looking at these things then that happen to them. I meant just refer to what I was saying in paragraph 3. Now let's look at paragraph 4 that deals with assimilation. And there's some very good news for you straight away here, and that is, although assimilation occurs a great deal in the speech of native English speakers, it's not compulsory for anybody. It's not necessary to make most of the assimilations we make. I'll give you the very few exceptions there are in a moment, but we don't have to. And in fact, it's better not to, on the whole, not to attempt to consciously make any assimilations. You will see certain assimilations in Professor Wells' diction. There are certain words that have a form that's followed by an arrow, like a word ending in N, for instance, will followed by an arrow, and then it will show you the same form but ending in N, that kind of thing. That shows a kind of assimilation that often occurs, that kind of, but you don't have to worry about it, you can forget it. Just aim to say the word all the time in this one way. Now, I'll give some examples here of typical assimilations that nearly all of us make most of the time. One is bus shelter, for instance. If you try and say bus shelter and hold on to the S so long it's clearly an S, you're going to make it too long. And if you make any part of a word or compound word too long relative to the rest, you're spoiling the rhythmical pattern of it. You're changing its structure, you're making it less clearly recognizable, or rather too clearly recognizable in some cases. You're making it unpleasantly unusual. So, bus shelter, don't worry about even saying the S there. Is she, and so on, is what we usually say. If you want to say is she, you have to slow down too much to get that out. So we generally make that sort of adaptation. Also in paragraph 4, they give you horseshoe and tortoise shell, for instance, as other similar examples. In paragraph 5, I mention at least one word that you really do have to generally make an assimilation with. In fact, what we can say is not that you make an assimilation, but that an assimilation has occurred historically. And now, there are 2 forms of the word used, the past tense of the verb use, right? There are 2 forms of that word. One is used, and it means employed, put to use, and the other means was accustomed, was in the habit of doing. So if you say, I was accustomed to attend lectures at University College at 9 o'clock every morning, you have to say, not I used to go to the lecture theatre at 9 o'clock, but I used to. You have to make that. And if you don't do that, you sound quite abnormal, because you sound as if you're using a word that means employed instead of a word that means was accustomed. So that's one, and there are a couple of similar ones to that. Most of these, though, most of the others are really not that important. They are optional. And even this used to one is not properly an assimilation in the way we normally use it, because it's something that's already taken place, but you need to know about it, because it's not revealed in the spelling. Similar to that are other historical assimilations. I've given you examples of a few there in paragraph 6. Let me read them for you. They're gooseberry, raspberry, fivepence, newspaper, and so on. Now, it doesn't matter the least if you say newspaper, but you probably find most people will say newspaper. So if you want to be in line with the majority, you do that. These, and with gooseberry and raspberry and fivepence, certainly with gooseberry and raspberry, if you want to use the normal kind of accent that's learnt on kind of courses we have here, then you have only the choice of those. Anything else will sound like, perhaps it won't sound completely wrong, it may sound like a different accent in English. For instance, in the North of England they say raspberry, raspberry. So, okay, doesn't matter much, but anyway, we usually make these assimilations. Now, paragraph 7 brings us to more or less the end of what I want to say about assimilation. I think it's perhaps the least important of the topics as far as our weak form words are concerned. And this is a kind of assimilation that does occur in many languages, particularly speakers of French, and the Slavonic languages have this kind of problem, many languages in Africa and so on. And that is, people anticipate the quality of the next sound in a word, in a compound word, and they produce words that sound very odd to us. Now, I've spelt them in the way we would imagine they would be spelt if they really did exist. They are producing non-existent words, of course, in a sense inventing words by mispronouncing the words they want. But here they are then, if you look 3 lines down in paragraph 7, backdoor, baseball, buzzroot, iceberg, Jew's bottle rather, Wadgeman, Rizwatch, rove ladder, roast beef, and of course, and on horseback. Now these are all, I see some of you do know the word for, yes, and these are intended to be, of course, backdoor, baseball, bus route, iceberg, juice bottle, watchman, wristwatch, rope ladder, roast beef, and on horseback, yes. Juice bottle, a lot of people don't get even the vowel right. They not only make the word juice unrecognizable, or rather, they make it, cause it to be recognized as some different word. They're trying to say the word juice, but they fail to make the appropriate shortening that I'm sure that you have been hearing about when you've been hearing about the various allophones of the English vowels. You know that you, before one of these sharp consonants, the fortis or voiceless, whatever you want to call them, consonants, that you have pataka, before one of those you have to keep anything that precedes it short. So if you don't make juice, quite short root there, juice, then you are saying Jews, and Jews is the plural of Jew. It means a Hebrew person, so you're not producing the right impression you intend. So, lastly then, about assimilation, is one other far less important, because it doesn't happen very often, but there are a few people, especially Dutch people, who tend to say things like dreadful and fog patches or flagpoles instead of dreadful, and fog patches and flagpoles. In fact, you'll find there are people in this country who say dreadful, dreadful, even occasionally very well educated ones, and certainly quite well educated people in the north of England. There's a famous Yorkshire town called Bradford, and that's the way they pronounce Bradford, in the town of Bradford. In the south here, we refer to their town as Bradford, but most of them call it Bradford. They've got a T there, if you like, usually realized as got a stop. And the last thing, I point out that people who don't manage their V's and W's properly will say things like, I'd love them, which sounds very odd, but I'd love them. So there's the least important of then assimilation. Now we go on to elision. Now this is the important one, because this is the one that refers to, is involved in most of the weak form words that we're going to be considering tomorrow. And I give some examples here. Best shown by example. Breaststroke, first stop, masked ball, next time, for instance. You'll find that it would be very wrong of you to try too hard to keep those compounds, keep their parts separate. If you say breaststroke, or first stop, or masked ball, or next time, That's ridiculous. Nobody who's a native speaker English ever says them in that way, unless they think they're talking to an idiot or a deaf person, right? Normally, they do not utter that T so clearly. They certainly don't release it. That is one of the rules of English, the English allophones of the consonants. If you have a plosive consonant ending a word, then you mask its release. You don't release it when a consonant begins the next word. And if you fail to obey that rule, then you produce very strange sounding English. So next time then, the easy way for you is not to worry that you even say the T next time. Most people don't. So that's one kind of elision involving the loss of consonant, and T being one of the most common consonants in the language. The three commonest consonants in English, most frequently occurring, are the three alveolar consonants, T and D and N. And so T and D are very often lost at the ends of words. N is not so easily lost. Then there are some similar things that can happen to vowels, or rather vowels and other things. And I've got some more examples here. Good deal, take care, Prime Minister, extra attention. All these sound perfectly normal to me. I've spent a good deal of time, and there I've completely lost the D at the end of good. A good deal of time, good deal of, whether it's the D at the end of good or the D at the beginning of deal, in the expression good deal, most people don't really, nobody says good deal and releases the D, and a lot of people only manage with one D articulation there. Because it's a natural thing to hurry up. A good deal of, they don't put a very good deal of effort into saying. So there we are. I've used these funny spellings, if you like, to show you what the mental picture of people have if they think about it. But most people, most native English speakers, will not be thinking of a wrong spelling if you use these, because these are such normal adjustments and reductions to make. If you say something that a native speaker has never heard before, then of course he may very well be fighting in his mind to think how it's spelt. And in that case, he'll be making up mentally some odd-looking spelling like some of these are. Yes, if we take an expression like 6:30, for instance, the 6:30, I put the T in it then, you could probably barely hear the T. But if I say 6:30, past 6, that sounds ridiculous. It sounds absolutely abnormal. Nobody bothers to say it that way, and a lot of the time people leave the sound out. So there's some elisions then, particularly of the alveolars. And now let's go to paragraph 9. This refers, paragraph 9, to elisions of vowels or reductions of vowels in the middles of words, and it concerns a number of quite important words because they're very frequent words in conversation. I've listed a few of them. You have to be careful of them because I'm afraid that traditionally even the pronouncing dictionaries, which are far better than the general dictionaries, I hope you fully realize that you should not, if you want to know what useful, reliable information about pronunciation of any word, do not try and get it from a dictionary written for native English-speaking people. Now, there are lots of very good dictionaries, from the greatest dictionary in the world, the Great Oxford Dictionary that came out in 1989 in the second edition. The first edition began being published in 1884. In 1989, a new edition came out in 20 volumes. Magnificent dictionary. The pronunciations in it are ridiculous, right? They're all over the place. Some of them are very modern, some of them are very ancient and haven't been used for 100 years. The publishers are generally unwilling to spend money on properly editing the pronunciation element in dictionaries. They usually leave it to the office boy or something like that, who copies what was in the, I've known one or two, I've even taught some people who work for the Oxford University Press in this way. And at that end of things, they do it very badly because they won't spend them. They get a few people to get the new pronunciations in this big new edition of the Great Dictionary. They just had some people looking to see what was in the earlier edition, and if they thought it needed changing, change it. Well, that's not the way to go about that. You need to do a little bit of research and have a bit of proper training, which they obviously didn't have. And anyway, avoid that dictionary. Similarly, avoid something like the Concise Oxford Dictionary, because although that is a good dictionary in most ways, and it's a dictionary that's, I think, sells more than any other in the world, certainly more than any other Oxford dictionary, except possibly the Advanced Learners, and I think even more than the Advanced Learners Dictionary. But the Advanced Learners Dictionary is highly reliable. It gives you a very good indication of pronunciation for practically all words. Of course, nobody's absolutely infallible. There are one or two words that I disagree with the present editor. I was myself the editor of the pronunciation of that dictionary in an earlier edition. I edited it, in fact recast its pronunciation for the 1974 edition. And that was the first time that anybody put American pronunciations in as well as British. And I made a number of changes about what people expected. And then a few years later I gave that work up, and they handed it over to a man called Gimson. You may have heard of him. He was supposed to have done it. Somebody did it anyway. And his name was attached to it, and her name as well. And they changed some of the pronunciation that I put in. And, okay, and I thought they'd changed it back to a rather more old-fashioned pronunciation. But then the laughable thing was that now yet another person has taken over pronunciating that dictionary, and he is one of the staff of University College, Michael Ashby. And Michael has changed back to what I originally showed for many of the words and endings and so on. So now you can be sure that the proper pronunciation of hopelessness is hopelessness, not hopelessness, as you would if you follow Gimson's advice. But there you are. We disagree amongst ourselves. And there's a new, fascinating new dictionary come out just this year now, a new edition of the great Daniel Jones dictionary. I hope you've all heard of that. It's the most famous dictionary in the EFL world, at least other than the Advanced Learners Dictionary. And the Daniel Jones dictionary, which has been steadily used by EFL people since 1917, sold in very large numbers, has recently, a few years ago, been acquired by Cambridge University Press. And they set another former colleague of mine, Peter Roach, with assistance of one of our teachers here, a great deal of assistance, to recast that. And that's, on the whole, a very good dictionary. I mean, it's a good rival to John Wells's. But I'm just in the process of examining it in detail, and I'm finding some little things I don't like about it. I think it shows, particularly words like the ones we're dealing with now, as being pronounced more slowly than they usually are. Because what has happened is that these words always amuse me when I look at them. They actually 100, 150, 200 years ago, these were very learned words that only scholars who read Latin knew, right? The common people didn't use them. It's amazing how quickly the most ordinary, uneducated people pick up new words and use them. Anyway, here they are. There was like, and I'm going to say them as they normally say. Actually, generally, obviously, usually. And so. Now, all those are 3 syllables each, as I just said them. And those are the normal ways of saying them. But I'm afraid that this Daniel Jones dictionary in the latest edition seems to invite you to go on saying them as they did in Daniel Jones's own day. Actually, generally, obviously, usually. Now, usually is not a usual pronunciation today. It's too slow. There are too many syllables in it. I hope you observe how people say these words and make sure you have the current, the normal, rather fast way of saying them, because people use them time and time again in conversation. Right then, so that's another kind of elision. And we have elided parts of the sense of these words, particularly in words like usually. What you do find, oddly enough, is that the adjective like usual or obvious still retains 3 syllables. But when we add a further ending on, which you'd expect it to make 4 syllables, we are too tired to say 4 syllables. We prefer to say 3. So we do something to the middle of the word, and in obviously we do something which is going to be referred to. In fact, it's not quite only elision that happens to it. It also, our next topic in paragraph 13, we're coming to in a moment, also occurs there. Obviously, undergoes enormous changes, actually. And obviously, this is what you will find, I think, in the yes. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what I think you'll find in the current new edition of the Daniel Jones Dictionary. And some people do say it slowly as that. But usually today, people cut out this pair of stuff by reducing that to, yeah, or they may drop it altogether and say obviously. And some people can't even bother to say V and a V. They say obviously, or obviously, or obviously, or obviously, obviously. You listen to somebody speaking really fluently, and they can go through all sorts of reductions of words like that they're saying repeatedly. Now, I'm not recommending you to pick up the fastest forms of them, but it may be obvious to you if you realize that so many people reduce them so much that you I'd probably better think about not trying to say obviously as 4 syllables all the time, unless you really want, for the purposes of your dramatic performance, to make it 4 syllables. I would think try and aim to make it 3, and that's a reasonable compromise. So there they are then, a number of words like that. And I've also mentioned there the word temporary. Right? Now the word temporary is a word that's changed a good deal since Daniel Jones's day. With Daniel Jones, I think this name has probably been mentioned to you before in this course of lectures. But anyway, Daniel Jones, who was born in 1881 and died in 1967, he was the great scholar of English phonetics of his age. And he revolutionized the description of the phonetic description of the English language by giving it to us in so much detail. And of course, the kind of English he described was what he called received pronunciation. Increasingly now, people are getting unhappy with the term received pronunciation. I think even Professor Wells is having doubts about it, but he still uses it. I gave it up 25 years ago. But anyway, and I call the same accent general British pronunciation. And I noticed that the new dictionary by Roach, the new Daniel Jones, no longer uses Daniel Jones's term for it. Not surprisingly, because Daniel Jones himself wasn't happy with it. It was his 3rd effort to try and find a name for his accent, because he obviously was going to represent his own accent, which was a perfectly commonplace one. He didn't. This is one of the great reliefs to me. Daniel Jones was not, when I was a student, Daniel Jones had come to the end, more or less, of his working life. But he did go around lecturing after he'd retired. And I remember as a student, I heard a lecture from him, and I read his books very carefully. I was extremely relieved to think that he sounded so normal, so ordinary, because he seemed to recognize and include in his works, his dictionary and his textbook, some pronunciations which were very old-fashioned, I thought, and others that were rather posh. I bet you all know the word posh. Posh meaning high class, upper crust, elegant, whatever word you're using for. Anyway, he himself didn't sound particularly posh at all. He sounded a bit old-fashioned because he did speak rather slowly. But then I think he only had one pace of speaking. He used to say gradually, right? And that's another one that, like the ones we've just had here, that you must be careful of. Don't say gradually, even though you think perhaps that's what even the pronouncing dictionary, some of them are inviting you to say it's gradually. Anyway, there are a number of words like that. Watch out for those 3-syllable, 4-syllable adverbs. But yes, I was beginning to talk about the word temporary, right? Now, the word temporary, I'm saying it now as it was usually pronounced, sometimes still is, 50 years ago or more, Daniel Jones's day. But life goes by very quickly these days, so people hurry over this word, and particularly when they've got to use it in adverbial form. So now people don't talk about a temporary appointment. If you ask for a temporary appointment in some very modern study, right? If you pick up the telephone and say, I'd like to apply for this temporary job in modern English, I think they'd say, well, no, you're no use, you're speaking old-fashioned English already, so we won't be employing you, right? Temporary sounds terribly old-fashioned. It's temporary. And I wrote that in my own little dictionary, which has syllabicity out of the R, meaning that if you wanted to, you could make that R a whole syllable, temporary. But what would normally happen, as it does with all syllabic consonants in English, is if there's another syllable following, vowel following, usually we don't even bother to make it syllabic. We just say R, set temporary. So temporary accommodation is the normal thing to say. And if you ask what I would like some temporary accommodation, then it will sound extremely old-fashioned. So this is the kind of thing that's happening to English speech during the present century. Anyway, now that causes some difficulty because people, once they start reducing those, find them a bit difficult to say and get worried about them departing from what the spelling suggests. So the word temporary was there at that time, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, in the adverbial form was pronounced temporarily. Right? That's how Daniel Jones would have said, temporarily. But nobody says it that way now, unless they're really ancient, even as old as me. They say temporary. Or now, because temporarily sounds so unlike the word temporarily, and suggests a spelling that involves a different word. There is a different word, there's the word temporal. Temporal is a word that refers to this present world, as opposed to the world to come, you know? So the temporals used to have temporal matters that don't concern the church. The church is concerned with spiritual matters. It's the word the opposite of spiritual. And so if you make an adverb out of that, temporal, by adding ly, you've got temporary. And there isn't really any difference between temporarily and what used to be temporarily any longer. We pronounce the word temporary. Okay. So this has worried some people so much that they've resorted to resting on an extra stress in the word. So you get the word temporary changed into, well, not in the adjective usually, but in the adverb they'll put the main stress later. So it's easier. And so they say temporarily. And now this has become a very popular pronunciation. You wouldn't have heard it 40 years ago. And people would have known about it 40 years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, because it's the one that most Americans use, temporarily. But now increasingly we're adopting it here. And one of the things that irritates me is when anybody hears a pronunciation, and pronunciation is changing all the time from the fascinating things about it. But if somebody hears a new pronunciation, one that strikes them as new, they say, oh yes, they're doing that under American influence. They usually say it without any justification whatsoever. We're not doing it out of American influence, we're doing it out of make it more comfortable to say, because it's got so many syllables. So there we are. All right then, passing on then from those, I'll give you some other examples here in paragraph 10. Warn you not to say take care, or windmill, or postman, or grandfather. Don't release those final consonants. Say postman, windmill, and grandfather, otherwise you create funny impressions. Again, I mentioned some historical allusions in paragraph 11, where you've got blackguard, and calm, and Christmas, and cupboard, and evening. We still cling to very silly spellings for words like cupboard. It'd be far better if we spelled cupboard in some more logical way, like C-U-B-B-E-R-D would be very nice for cupboard, do fine. But no, you can't persuade people to do that. And if you do it, they think you're mad, you're uneducated, you don't know the proper spelling of it. So all attempts to reform English spelling have come to nothing. You know, there have been successive generations of people who have tried to reform English spelling, and now they'll never succeed, because we've all got computers with spelling checkers on now, so you don't even have to think about spelling. So there we are, we're stuck with silly spellings like cupboard. And now, there's one little warning in paragraph 11. Be careful, there's one kind of elision that we don't make, and that is when we've ch or j at the end of a word, and another ch or j follows the next word, then we don't lose any of those. We say them both. So we don't say village church, or H.G. Wells and watch chain. No, we say village church, H.G. Wells and watch chain. And quite often I've heard people trying to simplify those. And finally, about elision, there's number 12, and that tells you that although it looks, and even again some of the pronouncing dictionaries exaggerate, I think, how frequently people say months and clothes and things like that. It's very common to say months and clothes for the plural of month, and well, clothes is only a plural. And 5th, 6th and 12ths are awfully difficult to say, and most people don't say them anything like 12ths, all those three consonants in succession. What they do is blend them and say them all at once. And I don't really particularly recommend you to try to do that. We can do it, but it's quite an acrobatic feat to blend them all. So 12ths will do. Leave out the f in 12ths, right? That's easy enough. So 5ths and 6ths are very common for that. And though I'm just mentioning, it suggests that, I heard it this morning, a report suggests that no announcer these days on the BBC bothers to say, suggests that, haven't got the time, life's too short, so he just says suggest and leaves the S off. Right, so the last two, that was the main one then of these phenomena. The last two are compression, which one I'm not going to deal with fully here because there's a certain overlap naturally between our various lectures, and you'll find that Professor Wells in a later lecture this week will be dealing at greater length with compression. But I do say with a little pride that I was the person who introduced this term into the phonetic literature, and it's now quite an important one, particularly if you read the works of Professor Wells, you'll see he uses it constantly. But here are examples of it then. Radio, 3 syllables becoming radio, following becoming following, and things like, now, I've said they're all alternatives, you don't need to bother with them, you can say radio or lenient, which is the example that Professor Wells gives in his dictionary, and you don't have to say lenient with 2 syllables, but there are certain ones you can't afford not to use, and, well, when I say can't afford to, you will sound a little unnatural, if you don't compress words like empire and rush hour. Now, when I say empire and rush hour, I am using the pronunciation that people used to use 100 years ago or less, right? Now we say empire and rush hour, and in fact, often we say not rush hour with a diff on R, but rush hour with just R. And of course, be on your guard, because if you really want to talk about the time when people are hurrying back and forth to work, early in the morning and late in the afternoon, right? That is the rush hour. That's when there's a rush in the tubes and the buses, right? That's the rush hour. But if you want to refer to that country which was largely composed of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, then don't make the final A of that R, because you will be pronouncing a word that, say Russia, not Russia, because Russia is our word, by compression of the our second syllable that we use for that hurrying time as far as our working day is concerned. Right, and lastly then, there's liaison. And liaison is linking. Linking usually involves linking R at the end of the word in English. And some people think that even some textbooks suggest that it's optional. You didn't bother to do it, but believe me, you will sound very unnatural indeed in your English if you, very foreign, very unnatural, very abnormal, if you don't make links in the places where we regularly make them. Even when we don't even have an R in the spelling, because we got so used to making these R links after the schwa vowel, as in a word like idea, that practically everybody says the idea of it. There's no R in the spelling, but this is what we say. So if you want to sound normal in English, it's better to say that than to say the idea of it, because idea of it sounds as if you're trying to avoid saying that R. And there are a few, there are a handful of people who are so fussy about that speech that they do try to say it. It would say those linking R sequences without the linking R's, because the R isn't there in the spelling. You know, there are always people they call them purists, people who think they know best how to speak, and they know how the They know the theories of how you should speak, and they base it on the spelling, and the spelling is sacred. It's a little bit like the Bible, British spelling. It's been handed down, and it shall not be altered, if you like. And so all our translations should follow it as closely as possible. But that's palpable nonsense, so take no notice of them. Oh, and I've given you in section 15 there a few more examples, particularly the ones that we always make our links in. Our own, right? Or else, better and better, later on, far off, other end, pair of, and so on. If you try and say these as our own, or else, or better and better, later on, far off, other end, pair of, and so on, you sound like, to me, I'm always reminded of, thank you. I'm always reminded of scholars, dons at Oxford or Cambridge in the early 1920s. There was a very precious group amongst them who had behaved like this in their speech. They sound very old-fashioned now, these people, but they were quite an active force at that time, and they did say them in those ways. But I'm not necessarily recommending you to do it if the vowel isn't schwa, right? If it's vowel number 7, or, right, as in drawing and so on, I would definitely advise you not to use gnaw and draw with a linking R, because people make fun of that. I've given you a couple of examples. People pour scorn on others who say drawing, although plenty of well-educated speakers do say it, but I would recommend you not to bother it. And of course I've given this example of law and order. Do you see that one? I've written as a girl's name. This is one of the things Mrs. Thatcher was noticed as saying, in law and order and so on. Of course, people used to write it this comic way to make fun of her. So, in the same way, children in the playgrounds of England have this little riddle. They ask you, do you know the book Dog's Delight by Nora Bone? Of course, that is do what a dog does with a dog, what the dog enjoys doing with a dog. Well, thank you very much this morning. See you tomorrow.